Okay, we'll bring the meeting to order. And first order of business on the agenda would be the approval of the summary minutes from February 5th, 2013 regular meetings. Hope everybody's looked at those and would take a motion for approval by looking over them.
I'll make a motion to approve the February 5th, 2013 minutes.
Second that.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Public hearing items, application number 2, SUP 13-1, filed by Bessie Rhodes, requesting a special use permit to allow an open-air market in the C6 Heavy Commercial District. This subject property located on the west side of North 9th Street of Thomas Park and addressed as 1615 North 9th Street. And we'll turn it over to Dean and City Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will be Mr. Herr's report to you on this item.
If you'll bring your attention to the aerial photograph that John has displayed here, this is the request area for the proposed flea market. It is a tract of land a little over 2 acres, of which 25,000 square feet roughly are developable. And you'll see the kind of the flat area where the building and the parking reside, as well as some of this green space to the north. That's the area we're going to primarily be talking about, as the rest of it is rather undevelopable with trees and some strange topography through there. So that's what we'll be looking at. To the north of the property, we have mid-Kansas sales here for trailer homes there, or modular homes. And then we also have some vacant land. To the east, we have the church. To the south, we have a automobile dealership and Thomas Park. And then to the west, we have some agricultural farmland. The temporary use permit process was originally adopted by ordinance in 1989, and the purpose of that temporary use permit process was to allow for transient retail and special events to take place with the permission of the zoning administrator. So occasionally you will see somebody with a truck or a van or a vehicle selling produce, blankets, other knickknacks, whatever the case may be. Sometimes the Swans guy, you'll see him also selling some food at a commercial location that has surplus parking, and therefore we would issue a temporary use permit on a temporary basis for those sales to take place. And what happened is, over time, staff noticed that some of these temporary use permits, namely farmers markets and open-air flea markets, had some lingering side effects that some of the other temporary use permits did not, and that they were a little bit more intense in nature, where you'd have multiple vendors, you'd have more traffic generated, and you potentially had lingering trash and debris after the event concluded. And as a result, the Planning Commission and staff got together in May of 2003 to talk a little bit about it, and the result of that meeting was the Planning Commission authorizing staff to look into a text amendment for open-air markets and farmers markets to change the criteria at which a temporary use permit was issued, and to create what they call a special use permit, which would require a public hearing before the Planning Commission for the first temporary use permit for those particular uses. The idea there being that with additional input from the public and neighboring properties, that there would be more forethought and planning on the part of the applicant, and also there would be more input from the neighbors towards any concerns they may have before the permit and before the event took place. And so in June of 2003, there was an 8-0 vote to approve this special use permit that the Planning Commission authorized staff to look at. Later, in April of 2004, Murray Simpson, who at the time was the tenant of the subject property we're looking at today, requested a special use permit for a open-air flea market similar to the request we're looking at today for no more than 20 vendors on the property we're looking at. The Planning Commission approved the special use permit by a 9-0 vote with some conditions of approval. The first being that the flea market did not exceed 20 vendors, and that any permanent signage would require a sign permit similar to any other commercial use, and that any violations found with the special use permit in the open air flea market would result in the revocation of the special use permit, and that the site should be cleared from all debris and vending stations and trash at the closing of every session. So those were the four conditions of approval in which that 2004 special use permit was approved. Now, the nature of today's request is very similar. We have the applicant, Bessie Rhodes, who is currently operating a thrift store business out of the existing building. And what Ms. Rhodes would like to do is expand that business to also have an open-air flea market where various vendors could come in and sell and retail their goods on weather-permitting days from sun up to sundown. The trash she will have taken care of on site with trash cans, and she will allow the vendors and their patrons to use the restroom that is part of the thrift store business. So there's currently a restroom inside the thrift store that would be used for the open-air flea market operation. The open-air flea markets are allowed with your approval in C3 districts or higher. This particular district, as noted on the front of the staff report, is a C6 zoning district, so that would definitely fall within that category. The location of the proposed flea market is on 9th Street, which is one of the main corridors into the city of Salina and does carry substantial traffic. The individual parking would be taking place on the paved area out front. John's got some photographs here of that, and he's also got a site plan that probably shows the entirety of the pavement. Here's the site plan John developed showing the 20 vendors and how they could potentially be on site. Now, this is a site plan that was developed by staff just to show how 20 spaces could be grouped around the existing building on the flat areas on the property. This is not something that specifically was proposed by the applicant. If you would go to the aerial photo, John. One thing that's a little bit different about this particular property than probably a lot of others is that there is a lightly used frontage road along 9th Street that serves the business to the north and to the south, as well as the thrift store. And the pavement on site, you can see, is kind of a U-shaped or V-shaped coming off of that frontage road. And so that's the pavement in the vicinity in which parking could potentially take place. The existing thrift store is 960 square feet, so it's a little under 1,000 square feet, and we do currently apply the off-street parking requirements for retail to that space, which is one off-street parking space for every 250 square feet of retail area. So currently, the applicant is required to have 4 off-street parking spaces for the thrift store business, and any parking that you would require as part of the flea market would be in addition to those 4 spaces. And those spaces would have to be a minimum of 8.5 feet wide by 19 feet deep, with a 24-foot driving aisle if it's a two-way driving aisle, 12 feet if the design is such that it's a one-way driving aisle with angled parking. The applicant does not have any specific signage in mind. There's been nothing proposed at this point, but the applicant has been notified that any signage that you would wish to put on the site would require a sign permit through our planning department to be reviewed and approved administratively. So I think with that said, one of your items that you'll be looking at and is somewhat tricky and based on a case-by-case basis is how much off-street parking is going to be required for the proposed off-street, for the proposed flea market if you wish to approve it, and if you do wish to approve it, how many vendors would you want the limitation of the flea market to be? Again, the applicant is proposing 20 off-street vendors, and the 2004 flea market was approved with 20 vendors. So I think that's where the applicant kind of decided to use the 20 vendor request and use that model as a template for her business moving forward. The alternative options that you have are to approve the requested flea market request, the special use permit, if you find that all of the requirements and code requirements and the off-street parking have been satisfied. You could approve the application subject to specified conditions similar to the 2004 special use permit for this property. You could postpone consideration of the application to a later date if additional information is needed for you to make the decision on what to do with the applicant's request. Or you could deny the application if the required findings cannot be made or if the proposed use is found to be incompatible with the uses surrounding this particular property. The staff's recommendation is that if you were to find that there is adequate off-street parking, that you would place a number of hours and of operation for the special use permit and place a cap on the vendors appropriate to the off-street parking that you feel is compatible, as well as require any signs to have a sign permit and require that the properties be cleared off after every flea market session. Are there any questions of staff?
Dustin,
Yeah, go ahead.
Dustin, I remember this application in 2004, and that dates me pretty bad, but I remember that the off-street parking was an issue, and that people were actually blocking that frontage road. And what is the legal right of people to park on that frontage road?
Well, typically, when we have a private business, we require that there's a certain amount of parking to be contained on that site as off-street, what we call off-street parking. In other words, parking that doesn't leak out into the public right-of-way. Now, parking in the public right-of-way, as long as it isn't posted or prohibited, is certainly fine. You can park in front of the street in front of your house. That's something that's very normal. It's a matter of your judgment on how much of that you want to see with this, or if you want to see it all with this special use permit. Now, you're right. Historically, these types of uses, again, there's nothing prescribed like we have for other retail uses, where we have one parking space for every 250 square feet of retail area. We don't have anything like that prescribed in the code, and it's a case-by-case basis where if you feel that there is street parking that could be used, on-street parking that could be used in a lightly traveled area, and that's acceptable to you, then that's your prerogative. But as far as not allowing it unless it's posted, or unless this board specifically doesn't want to see it as part of this special use permit, there is nothing that prohibits that type of parking.
My question specifically, though, was, is it legal to park on that frontage road?
It is legal to park on the frontage road.
Okay. And do I also remember that in 2004 that was somebody was using that as a flea market in an unpermitted use, and it was brought to us kind of after the fact? Is this the right one?
That has happened here and in other locations. That is correct.
And I remember part of the discussion being on the I guess I have a somewhat of a problem with that. You know, especially if it blocks traffic to the other two businesses to the north and the south from having people access their properties. And I know that the applicant certainly can't police that, but you know, it does happen. People come and they park wherever they can. But I remember that was a discussion or a topic of discussion when we looked at that initially.
Any other questions of staff? Do we have the authority as this commission to put up signs on one side of that frontage road that would say no parking on this side between Saturdays and Sundays I mean, do we have that? Who dictates no parking signs and how they're
The
put there?
city engineer would generally respond to that. For instance, Pacific Court comes to mind, which is that little dead-end street off of Pacific, off the North Ohio overpass. We have a problem over there with semis parking on street, and previously they were parking on both sides of Pacific Court, and then the city engineering went in and posted parking on one side only. It's still not ideal because you still have semis parking on one side of the street, but at least it is limited to one side. This is a frontage road. It's not wide enough to have cars park on both sides and have...
They were doing.
They were doing it. And that is part of the challenge, is keeping the number of vendors down to be proportional to the available off-street parking. The other problem we had in 2004, before it got to the Planning Commission, is that the vendors were setting up in the right-of-way along the frontage road, which only encouraged people to park there instead of on-site. In the case of when we had the lead sled, which is now moved to Oakdale Park, that used to be held at Thomas Park, we limited parking temporarily to one side of the frontage road for people who were attending the lead sled events at Thomas Park, but that was done through temporary signage. We don't have any permanent signage out here because on a permanent basis there's hardly ever any cars out there. So.
But if that was one, so how would we go about that? If that was one option of allowing parking only on the right side or particular side that's there, would we then propose that to?
You would recommend that the city engineer post that for parking on one side only.
And do they readily agree to that, or is that something that has to go through their board or through?
No, it's within their discretion. They'll look at the width of the street and they'll look at what's going on there and generally be responsive to that.
Would the applicant pay for the signs, or is that just city expense?
That would be the city's expense.
Okay.
Is there any kind of norm that says so much parking per vendor, or, you know, you have your rules and regs for parking per square foot of building? You're adding a lot of vendor space there, and you if you have a 900 square foot building, you have so many parking spaces for it, and you have so much space of vendor space. Wouldn't it make a sense that you'd have so many spaces per space of vendor? I mean, does that make sense?
It does make sense, except that flea markets and their settings are so varied as far as, and that's why they're coming before you to approve the location through a special use permit, is that the circumstances and the surrounding property varies so much, and the opportunity for shared parking. This whole process originated from a flea market over on South Broadway, which was across the street from Crossroads Church. And what was happening was that the people attending the flea market were using the church's spaces without permission. They were blocking the holiday drive over there with parking on both sides. But in that case over there, because of some shared parking opportunities with Maggie Mays and other places, the Planning Commission required 6 off-street parking spaces for 18 booths. which may be on the low side, but there was opportunity for shared parking. There was also recognition that some vehicles, no matter what you did, were going to park in Holiday Drive. And because flea markets tend to be like garage sales, many of you have experienced how people park when they're visiting a garage sale, and people tend to do that with flea markets as well. So you would have to assume that no matter what we do in the way of designated spaces for off-street parking, that you're still going to have some people who won't leave the frontage road and will park their vehicles there, and that has to be taken into account as you look at this and judge how many vendors should be allowed. Again, the 20 is not our number, it's not our recommendation, it's what the applicant is seeking.
And I'd also point out, just to make sure there's no confusion, that this would be a daily flea market that could happen on weekdays as well as weekends with weather permitting, when it's nice out.
Most of our flea markets have been weekends only.
Would vendors be required to park in designated parking areas or along the street, or would they be allowed to park in their booths? Or is that something that we
They
have
wouldn't
control
be,
of?
they probably wouldn't be allowed to park in their booths simply because of the limited paved area. That's going to be a premium space for the off-street parking, where the vendors are probably going to be on the grassy areas to the north, to the west, and probably to the south of the building. If you can show your proposed site plan there, John. This is what Mr. Berger came up with, not necessarily with the input of the applicant, but just to show how 20 vendors would fit or could fit on this site. Now, this is something that the applicant will have to come up with on her own, but this is just an idea that you could have, clusters of 2 to 5 around the building in different configurations on the flat grassy areas.
But each of those vendors probably comes with a vehicle.
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
And so would those vehicles be allowed to park on the grassy areas?
They would not.
Okay.
Dustin, what do you figure that paved concrete area there is capable of parking? Or how many spaces do you figure that as?
It's not currently striped, which is part of the problem with trying to actually figure that out. Until you have a plan that's drawn out and measured, it's difficult to tell. This width here is about 24, 25 feet. This is about 18 feet. And then you've got an area between the property line and the building that's, I think it's around 40 or so. That's going off memory. And so you can maybe get 8 or 9, I'm guessing, and 4 of those would have to be specifically allocated towards the current thrift store business.
Right.
There may be a creative way to get more than that if you used angle parking and had a one-way configuration where you came in one way and exited the other, where you can maybe even have some parking, along the drives there. I'm not completely certain.
Hold on real quick. I'll let you go. Yeah, if any other questions? If not, we'll hear, maybe the applicant has a plan for all of our questions, so. We're ready for that?
Yes.
If we'd hear from the applicant now, is the applicant? You can come to the podium, please, yeah. State your name and address. We'd love to see you.
Don't be bashful.
Hi, I'm Bessie Rhodes, and didn't you guys tell me that on the north side of the building that I could use that for parking, and I was going to use the cement part up here for the booths, and the south side of the building for booths? If I do the north side of the building for parking, there's plenty of parking right there. I'll just open up the fence.
This
Oh,
one.
that's
Push
the north
that button there and the light will
Oh.
have a flame show.
Oh, right here. This is the north side of the building. Now I could put parking in there, just open up that fence right here. the little gate, and people could come in there and park, and just have vendors along here and right here, if so needed. It's only going to be 4 by 8 tables, and some people might want 4 of them, but you know what I'm saying? It's not going to be a great big flea market.
Bessie, if you open that up for parking, are you talking about making any preparations, or would it just be on the existing ground, the grass?
Just be on the existing ground.
Okay.
Because this area right there is pretty big. And I could use this for the flea market people.
And did you
set up tables.
I'm sorry, did you envision that parking area as being primarily for vendors or for anybody?
For anybody. But I was thinking, I think I talked to Dean and thought about doing the parking over there in the grass area.
Can you do that?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. The grass area parking would be not necessarily for vendors, but for anyone.
Oh, yeah, for
regardless.
anybody that
Okay.
wants to shop on the flea market. Mhm.
So
And
those
then-
little squares that he was showing up on the drawing there, those are 20-foot apiece? You were thinking that the vendors would take up less space than that? Is that what you were thinking?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I rent tables, it's 4 by 8 tables, only $10. So,
Also, just out of curiosity, are they going to have tents, or will this just be open air?
just open air.
Okay.
I don't want it too junky.
Yeah.
And is there any zoning issue? I guess if I think of like at the Bicentennial Center, when we have the fair and the carnival takes over the Bicentennial parking lot, people park in the grass on the back side. I mean, maybe that's for a weekend, and this is going to be every day. And
No, it'll
and-
be for the weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. During the week, I'll have the thread shop going.
I guess my question would be, Dean, is that any type of a violation of parking on the grass for an extended amount of time within the city limits?
It is generally allowed on a special event overflow basis, but not on a regular basis. And Dustin was referring to temporary use permits and things that relate to our fireworks. If somebody came forward with a plan for a fireworks stand and their plan was to have parking on grass, it would not be approved, because you have to, first of all, provide off-street parking on a paved surface. In looking back at the notes, when Marie Simpson was here, it was understood by everybody at the time that if the vendors had trailers or vehicles or things, that they would be parked next to their stand, and that the paved areas would be available for customers primarily. The other thing that was done is that there was a shared parking agreement with what was then Bob's Pawn Shop, to allow customers to park there who were shopping at the flea market. But as Mr. Mikesell correctly recalls, none of that actually worked, and the issue still continued to be excessive parking on the frontage road itself. And again, part of that may stem from simply being over-optimistic about the number of vendors. The plan in 2004 was for 20 vendors. I don't think there was ever a time where there were more than 10 to a dozen, and there were still, you could not get people to pull in and park on site. They would only park in the frontage road. So you have to assume that's going to happen. But the real question here is 20 vendor spaces excessive based on the size and improvements that we have available on the site?
In terms of parking, I wanted to make one observation while you're still up here, Bessie, is I took the opportunity to drive out and just kind of look at it today. And my supposition from looking at the two businesses on the north and south of this site are that they probably wouldn't necessarily on any one given time supply a lot of traffic. There's a my assumption is there wouldn't be a lot of pressure on parking from those two businesses. The other is I've got a little bit of a concern about parking on grass in the event of rain and therefore mud. But if you have the kind of open air that I'm hearing you describe, if it's going to be rainy, a lot of people won't be out there and therefore won't be seeking to park.
That's true.
So that somewhat allays my concern. And again, I know I'm hypothesizing, but just looking at the situation, that would be my observation.
Ms. Rhodes, I have one other question, too. How many days a week do you really see yourself operating this? Because the way the application reads, it looks like it could happen 365 days a year, and I don't think that's what you really intend. So
I don't think
what do
a
you
lot of
think
people come
what are
out.
you really looking for?
Mainly Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is mainly when people come out and do it, or on a special holiday where you got a 4-day weekend. But hardly no one goes out on Friday to Thursday, flea marketing. It's usually Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Right, but if this were approved and I had a stand I wanted to set up and say, gosh, I'd really like to have this on Tuesday, you would go ahead and
Not
say...
if you guys don't want to permit it, no.
Okay, all right.
That's what I said. I just want to follow the rules and do what I can to
Sure,
open it.
I understand. And we're just
Yeah.
trying to figure out what it
Yeah,
is you
just tell
really,
me what to do
what you
and I'll
really
do it.
want.
You know, I don't have a real concern with street parking. We operate a whole downtown with street parking. But would it be a problem for you if we suggested no parking maybe on the east side of that road and then allowed parking on the west side of that Service Drive Road? Would that present, in your opinion, any problem for the businesses up and down there? And I think Todd suggested that might, or asked the question about that might not be a bad solution, is go no parking on one side and then allow on-street parking on the other side.
And I talked to my neighbor, and he's fine with it. He said he wrote a letter and said everything was okay with him.
It's where people tend to park anyways along the road because they want to come in a little bit and then leave. And
In addition, I would have to Mr. Welch's question, however, is how much of that no parking signage would be required to enforce it, to get that idea across?
Well, and how far do you take that down? Is it just in front of the requested property? Is it just in front of my property? Is it in front of the old pawn shop property as well? And then are you infringing on, but, you know, with that being said, I want to commend you on your entrepreneurial spirit for doing it. I mean, I think that's awesome. And I love that we're talking about a parking problem. I mean, that's good, you know, I mean, if we didn't think it was going to work or it hadn't worked in the past or there wasn't a need for this in the north side of town, we wouldn't be discussing this if there wasn't a parking problem. So I think that's great that we are saying that this could work. We think this is probably a good idea, just how do we make it work so that there aren't calls and accidents and people backing in from that. I think we're on the, or at least for me, on the right track of limiting one side and doing am I off base, Dean or Dustin, by saying that we could have her apply for is this not considered a temporary thing if it's done every Saturday and Sunday for them to park on the grass? Is that more than temporary? A temporary permit for them to park from the north side over as overflow if the street, or could that be vendor parking and allow the street to be available for customers?
What Dean mentioned earlier is evidently in 2004, that was part of the special use permit, that the vendors would park next to their vending table. So they were on the grass. But Marie's special use permit was for Saturdays and Sundays only. It was not a weekday type of flea market or year-round week, 7 days a week type of flea market. So those are some differences there, but it sounds like there may be some discretion on your part as a temporary basis, as part of a special use, to limit the amount of off-pavement parking that you have, in other words, unimproved surface parking that you would have as part of the special use permit for the vendors only, not extending that to the patrons and customers.
And then I see a different idea. That must have been John's drawing, and yours is more so you're wanting to bring the 4x8 tables up onto the concrete that's currently there. Is that how you envision that?
Yeah, bring it in the front.
Okay, so could you point out where you would envision the vendors being?
I would have them along here, in this area right here.
Okay, so if we did a temporary parking for the vendors over in 8 through 20,
Yep,
only on Saturdays and Sundays,
Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays.
Yeah.
And did a special for that and allowed the patrons to park on the frontage row on the east side or west side, whichever they see more feasible. Is that
That's
something, if
fine.
the commission were to approve that?
I'd rather have the vendors park somewhere else than by their tables, because that's looking for an accident to happen. You know,
Okay.
too many people be walking around for people to have their cars anywhere. I think they should be able to park here.
Just vendors only.
If that's what you want, I say anybody could park over there.
Well, the good thing with the vendors is you would have the vendors park and they would stay for the whole day. You wouldn't have traffic coming in and out, where you'd have traffic and dust and more potholes and ruts and things like that of that happening in there, of ingress and egress out of there. I kind of like that plan. I mean,
Well, I think if you consider something like that, then you've totally eliminated all of the customer parking or the off-street parking requirement. I mean, totally. If that paved area is used for tables, you certainly don't want cars driving in and out of there while people are working. Then there's no place for off-street parking, period. Even the 4 spaces that are required for the thrift store.
I'm going to ask you one other question on away from parking,
Yeah.
and then probably Dean will have to help us out. When you have a restroom in the existing building, are there 2 restrooms, male and female? Is it just a single restroom?
Single restroom.
And I'm going to ask the question, I don't know if it makes any difference or not, is it ADA disability
Compliant.
accessible?
Yeah.
I mean, is
Yes,
it wide
it
enough to accommodate a wheelchair or somebody with a disability?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, is that a requirement of this type of business, that they first provide restroom facilities, and secondly, that they be accessible?
It is a requirement that they tell you and explain to you how they're planning to provide restroom facilities to customers and vendors, and it's their job to persuade you that it's been adequately addressed. So when we review a consumer fireworks permit stand, we ask them to tell us how they're going to provide restrooms. Some of them have the ability to access an existing building or business on the site. Some of them bring in porta potties for the duration of the fireworks sales. And so it's addressed on a case-by-case basis. But we have a checklist that we go through to say, how are you going to address parking? How are you going to address restrooms? How are you going to address trash collection? And it's up to the applicant to explain to you how they're going to address each of those items.
do you have to require, again, and you have a great point on there, of taking those away. If you did take them away, wouldn't you still be required to have at least one handicap accessible, hard-surfaced, marked area?
That requirement is applied and enforced through obtaining a building permit, and there's not been a building permit issued on this property in a number of years, which is why it does not have presently a marked handicap accessible space. But I think the challenge here that we're trying to point out is that most of these types of markets and all are, they would formerly locate in the Gibson's, now Ace, parking lot where there's abundant surplus parking and surfacing is not an issue. The challenge here is the limited amount of paving and the fact that the owner of the property, Mr. Schmidt, and none of the tenants want to invest money in expanding the paving to make it proportionate to what they want to do with the property.
Dean, I don't recall exactly, but Stutzman's on South Ninth, it doesn't have restrooms, uses porta potties, I believe.
That is
And I
correct.
believe some of that is gravel parking. It's not all paved either.
Right.
It is a mixture. There was some pre-existing gravel there. That is
Right.
correct.
So we've got an example on South Ninth of what we're talking about here, and it doesn't even have the off-street potential that this possibly does.
Well, we don't have problems with people parking on Cloud or 9th Street because you can't park there, one, and two, they have adequate off-street parking for their business. It's not a question of area there at
pretty busy.
Stutzman's as it is here.
They use street parking around the business too, I mean, on the off-side streets.
So if they were to gravel everything over there, put rock down, would that solve the issue?
No. Because
This is a C6 district, which all off-street parking is required to be paved, so any expansion on any existing parking lot would have to be paved. Now, if this was a pre-existing non-conforming where they had gravel similar to the old Bob's Pawn Shop to the south, where they already have a gravel parking lot, you could maintain it. You couldn't expand it, but you could at least maintain it and use it in its current state, but you cannot expand the parking as a gravel lot unless and the only way you could expand the parking is if you paved it.
I wanted to just remark that I think Mr. Maxwell has a very good point. If you have the booths on the pavement around, you don't want cars driving in there. I would hope that that would be easily changed by marking that off so that it is only walking area. And I don't know exactly what we mean by off-street parking, but again, the parking on that private road would appear to be mostly sufficient.
My experience was after we approved that it was pretty heavy at times. In other words, like from the park clear north, that it was very crowded on both sides of that street. I think if you limit that to one side of the street, you're going to be, and if you, let's just do the math. You got 20 vendors out there. Let's say at any one time there's 2 people visiting each spot. So that's 40 vehicles parked up and down there on one side of the street. It's going to get kind of crowded.
That might be an argument for reducing the number of vendors at least somewhat.
Certainly.
Which we could do that. You know, narrow it down to 15.
That would be the number I had in mind.
No, I say, I had no idea how many people would come and set up.
You know, this may be a silly suggestion, but we can sit here all night talking about how we're going to reconfigure somebody's business. It seems to me like staff could work with the applicant and look at some solutions that's worked and reasonable, talk to Dan about no parking on one side, and then if you're not in a big hurry, come back with a plan that we could look at and say, staff thinks this would work, you think it could work. I think we all want you to be successful. It's another business. Hopefully we'll get some traffic off of I-70 that'll come into our community and head on in and do some other business.
And we do get a lot of that.
Right. And so, but I just think we can't hardly design it all of us sitting here. I mean, I think that's some staff knows the rules. You know what you need. Let the two of you work it out and then bring us a recommendation back.
However, I'm
That's
thinking
right.
we've given some very wise suggestions, don't you?
Yeah. I do too.
As long as we get it done by March something.
Well, I think that's why we have a little bit of time and
But I don't mind the overflow as a special permit of allowing the vendors to park over in that, even though it's a grassy area. I mean, I'm just
Right.
putting out,
They're going in and coming
I'm
out.
putting my
one
2
time a
cents
day,
out
two
there.
times a day, in
Two
and
times,
out.
yeah. I mean, if for Saturday,
on all of these.
Saturday and Sunday only
Okay.
on there, I think that that's going to be where your biggest crowds are at. So even though they're open Friday, I think that most people are working Friday. Saturday and Sunday, park the vendors over there with a special permit in the grass and set up your vendors there. And then to answer his question, on there, your other times, you will have the 4 parking spots. And they may just have to park in the designated area. I mean, you're still not going to have the 4 available for the square footage that you have as an enclosed building. But again, I think in my opinion, I'm trying to put a building down there again, I'm just excited we're talking about all this traffic. I know many
Get more
businesses, we'd
people
love to
in
have
Salina,
a traffic
yeah.
problem. They've got a parking lot for 40 people and they've got 2 cars in it. So we've got the opposite problem for you, which I think is great.
Thank you. Am I done?
Any other questions for staff or applicant? You'd have to make a recommendation, I believe, to send it back to there. Be open for a motion.
Do you want a motion or a recommendation, Dean, for this? Motion?
Well, you need to, and Dustin
Sorry.
has the
We
report
apologize.
in front of him. Dustin, will you please read the recommendation and options back to them?
Let's, hold on real
And
quick. We'll open
the
for public
findings
comment.
that they need to make?
Yeah. Done with you unless you have any other questions on there. Thank you so much. My apologies, first time here setting the
We need to
calls
hear
here,
if
so
there's any other
thank you for
public
doing that.
comment.
Anybody from the public would like to speak?
First of all, I'm not saying that I'm against the vendors.
Name and address.
Name it.
2004.
Name and address.
Sid Ridge, and I live at 1535 North 9th, which is right directly behind that, across the dry ditch. Okay? We had a problem last year with the vendors that were selling produce. Is the stuff soiled or spoiled? They chunked it in the ditch. What happened there was that we were overrun with raccoons and possums and everything else. Secondly, we are a little wondering if these vendors going to be allowed to stay overnight at their site, if they have the table, or they've got to go somewhere else. Well, the other thing is these vendors that you talk about, are they people that didn't want to have a yard sale at home and are bringing this merchandise to sell? Because that's where a lot of this other stuff came from. They put it up for sale for a weekend and it didn't sell, so what are they going to do with it? They toss it on the ditch. Now, if you said that the checklist had a, what are they going to do with the trash?
I'm gonna have a trash, a van come and pick up the trash. I'll have one of the big dumpsters set out there. And I'll make sure everything's cleaned up, every done.
Well, that's my only problem with it.
Yeah, it's a good concern.
That's a good question.
Thank you.
I think maybe that may be inside when you come back on there, maybe to address his concern with him being so close on there as the produce, or whether you contact a waste management systems and have a dumpster there that you provide for your people to put everything in after they're done with it.
The only other thing
Can you,
You may want
I'm sorry,
to-
can you come up to the mic? They would like to have you there.
You got to record.
there, and they brought their kids with them. They went right around the backside, and if you'll notice, on our property runs a straight line all the way through there. And I've got horses. And probably you're going to say, well, that's an attractive nuisance. But when you look up and you find 10 people sitting out in the middle of your pasture feeding carrots from one of the vendors in it, and what do we, how do I control this?
Yeah. Are they is there a ditch there? I mean, are they
Yes.
going through there?
Well, it's a dry creek bed.
Dry creek bed?
And they just walk down the other side and walk right straight across through.
Mm-hmm.
On the back side of where you're talking about the parking place there's a pretty good separation. But on this side where it first starts out, there's just a matter of 15 feet. And so if you look a little further down there, they can walk down there and walk right over in the back side of the pasture without even getting their feet dirty.
Do you have any recommendation for that at all?
That's why I say, I'd like to know, what do I do? Put a bunch of nasty signs up?
It would seem to me that if you could work with the owner of the business and communicate with her that that's not,
We did
shouldn't
that in
happen, then those
2004.
people could be eliminated from coming. And then if they don't eliminate from coming, that becomes trespassing issues, doesn't it? I think. It's your property.
We tried that in 2004, and it just brought, well, gee, what are they going back there for? Oh, you got horses. And I know this is the West, but a lot of people out here find horses pretty fascinating. I'm one of them. But we tried that about the trash last year, or 2004, and we tried it with about the people. It's not adults, it's kids. I mean, how do you tell a kid he can't pet a horse? Bring a release from your parents that you can pet a horse? I mean, how do I do this, gentlemen? I don't want to be the mean old ogre. But horses do react to strangers different than they do their owners. And I don't have a mean one in the bunch that I know of.
Okay.
Would it be a trespassing violation?
It would seem to me that and signs only work for people who read them and want to follow them, but I think you'd be surprised at how many people, when you tell people don't do something, they really do stop doing that. I think even youngsters who are 12 or 13 years old. So the first thing I would think is be sure that there would be some signage hanging on those posts that would let people know that they shouldn't be there. Will it work 100% of the time? No.
I mean, we tried that on the other side, and this is a whole different issue from the park. Park's property and my property are adjoining each other. Yeah. And you can tell them all you want to. And by the time the city or the county gets there, they're long gone. So I was just wondering about these kids. That's the only thing that's bothering me.
Sign says horses bite. I don't know. I don't have a good question for an answer to
They
that.
can kick too.
Yeah. Thank you for your time for coming.
Thank you.
Again, that'll give the applicant some time to address some of those issues
With staff.
with staff.
Is that, do we need a motion to send it to the applicant work with staff, or do we need a recommendation?
I'd
Dustin?
like to rehash some of the findings and go over those on page 5 in your report. And I'll just read them to you, and if you have any questions, let me know. But number 1, in deciding whether a special use permit for an open-air market should be approved, you'll need to look at these findings. And number 1 is the dates and hours of operation of the proposed market will be compatible with the uses adjacent to the proposed market location. And the applicant has proposed sunrise to sunset, but in our experience, it's best to have an actual time, a beginning time, whether that be 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. or whatever the case is, whatever you guys feel is appropriate. It makes things a lot easier on our end to know exactly what those time parameters are. Number 2, the amount of noise generated by the market activity will disrupt the activities on the adjacent properties. Number 3, adequate utilities and sanitary facilities are available or will be provided at the site. Number 4, adequate provisions have been made for the removal of trash and litter from the site. And number 5, the off-street parking required to support the market can be accommodated on site or without causing undue disruption or interference with the flow of traffic on adjacent public streets or with the rights of surrounding property owners to use their parking facilities. And as staff has kind of talked about, one of our, and you guys have talked about quite a bit here as well during this meeting, is our biggest concern is establishing an appropriate ratio of vendors for the off-street parking that's on site. Some of the ideas that we've heard about are somewhat concerning in that, like Mr. Mikesell, we have concerns about using some of our precious paved area for vending display when it could probably be used towards off-street parking, since we don't have a lot of parking on site. That seems to kind of be a double whammy there, where we're using our precious paved area and also increasing the amount of parking we have by having vendors there. So that's something that I think we would very much so recommend against. And as also is pointed out, that is also a driveway into the site and out of the site, which again, maybe it may not be a good idea to have the vendors there in our mind. And while in 2004 it seems as though the grass area was used for vendor parking, again, we really try to stay away from that as much as possible as staff, because of the off-street parking requirements that we do typically have for businesses. We just want to be careful about how far we go with that, and so to keep that in mind. So establishing the ratio of vendors, the number of vendors that you would limit this particular flea market to if you were to approve it, is going to be important. And then also establishing how we would operate our off-street parking or on-street parking in this particular instance is going to be important, and it needs to be well defined as well, I think. So with that said, we do have the 4 conditions of recommendation that you see at the bottom of page 5 and 6, and a 5th one that we would also recommend that's not in the staff report, but we have done before and often and did with the Stutzman special use permit that's been brought up, is to have this particular board have a second public hearing if you were to approve this 1 year from now. Typically, once we have a special use permit that's approved, that's gone through the public hearing and is approved by the Planning Commission, it becomes renewed on an annual basis administratively through staff. And what we would recommend is if you choose to move forward with approving this particular open-air flea market, that this particular flea market would be reviewed again 1 year from now, and that would be the 5th condition of approval.
And I think my recommendation, possibly misunderstood, was I would suggest that the applicant work with staff, not approve it at this meeting, have it for approval next meeting, but work with staff and iron out some of those conditions and numbers. Maybe John had a good idea of how the arrangement could be. We all have ideas, but I think you know the rules. She knows what she wants. Let you two work it out. Come back with a recommendation to us as to how this might work, including talking to Dan Stack about one side, no parking.
And
That gives you an opportunity to meet the needs of the city and work with the applicant, and then we can approve it after that.
And that could be an appropriate option. That is one of the alternatives that we've laid out for you. Number 3 is to postpone if more information is needed, which could be additional meetings between the applicant and staff to work on some of the details of the off-street parking if that's what you wish. But we just wanted to make sure that you guys understood some of our concerns and understood the findings that you need to make when making a decision as you deliberate your thoughts here.
And I certainly understand, I'm okay if you come back and the recommendation is this is simply not going to work at this site. I mean, but you know the rules better than we, so there's too many unanswered questions here. I think the applicant needs to spend some time working with city staff to figure out how it can or cannot work. So that would be my recommendation and a motion if necessary.
Second the motion.
I have a motion and a second. Any other discussion?
None.
All in favor, indicate by saying
That
aye.
would be, that would be continued to March 5th.
Okay. March
Okay,
5th.
Fine.
Motion.
Will I be able to start the flea market in March? Because I asked you guys to help me with this before.
Not until March 5th,
Not until March 5th, I think, is when
12th, or whatever.
The,
I'll be approved or disapproved, right?
that's correct.
and then you would have a petition period also after that,
For how many days?
14 days.
So then she can't start till March.
What I have to do is, yeah, they're supposed to work with me
So that would put it at the middle of March.
Okay. Okay.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I would probably come up with a drawing on your own of what you have in your head about the vendor tables and all that, bring that into city staff and let them work with that and put it in the arrangements of what will work and what won't. Again, thank you to the public for, or I shouldn't call you public, but I know I've seen you in here a couple of times, especially you're in a very interesting home back there with what goes on in the park and what you're surrounded with. So I've seen you a couple of times just on TV coming in with different things going on in the park. So I know where you're at and some of the things that you have to deal with out there.
Yep.
So I appreciate your comments, and I think you guys can work together. So, all right, thank you. Okay, perfect. We'll continue on with application public hearing item number 3. Continue discussion of Z 12-3 filed by Salina City Planning Commission requesting a comprehensive review of Article Division 2 off-street parking, Section 42 of the zoning ordinance to consider possible changes to the surfacing requirements for off-street parking areas, continued from May 15, 2012. So we'll hear from city staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've got a background report here that we shared with you and wanted to share with you again, and also this is coming back to you because we have completed our study of what other communities, peer communities in Kansas do in relating to their surfacing standards for off-street parking areas. And just by way of history, until 1988, the zoning ordinance was pretty much silent on the question of paving. It was basically up to the individual landowner, and so paving was essentially optional. The Planning Commission elected to change that in March of 1988 and recommended a new standard that required paving with asphalt or concrete with a few exemptions. The Board of City Commissioners adopted that amendment. Rather than addressing grandfathering rights, which is a very difficult thing to get a hold of in enforcement and administration, the approach that was taken there was we'll give everybody who has a gravel parking lot 5 years to come into compliance. Well, that was problematic, both practically and legally in terms of people's proper grandfathering rights. And so when city staff sent out letters to the owners of properties with gravel parking lots in 1990, reminding them that they had 3 years to come up with a plan for paving all their lots. We'll just say that all hell broke loose from those owners, and they descended on the city commission opposing the implementation of that 5-year period. And many of the objections related to not knowing about the ordinance change, and primarily about the cost of compliance of bringing their gravel surfaced areas into compliance within that window. So the City Commission asked that the question be re-examined and that there be additional opportunity for public input. And so in 1990, the Planning Commission held 2 public hearings on the subject, and they recommended some changes. And one of the changes that the Planning Commission recommended was that existing gravel parking lots be exempted or grandfathered in, and that if there was a change in use or a building is built or expanded, then only the new or enlarged parking area would need to be paved. And then it maintained the exemption for gravel spaces for parking lots or parking areas that had 6 or fewer spaces in a residential setting. It maintained the exemption for I-2 and I-3 properties. And so with that grandfathering provision in there, these changes were unanimously approved, and they've essentially been in effect since that time. So John, you've turned off the machine there, but if you could fire it back up and get to the handout attachment 1. So we thought we would walk you through this so that you would understand how this is presently administered. So today, the exemptions from the paving requirement are residential driveways, parking lots in residential zoned areas containing 6 or fewer spaces. So if I had a triplex and I had 6 parking spaces for that triplex, those parking spaces could be gravel today. Permitted uses in our A1 zoned areas, which we don't have many of those, but if I had an area that was zoned A1 and I had a horse stable or a farmstead that had been annexed into the city but retained its agricultural zoning, then gravel is permitted there. And then permitted uses in the I-2 and I-3 zoned areas are exempt from paving. And if I had a small church or small park or recreation facility that had 6 parking spaces or fewer, then that could be gravel, but if I get above that, it has to be paved. All commercially zoned areas and I-1 zoned areas have to have paved parking. So you'll go around town and you'll see some mini storage complexes, and some of those mini storage complexes have gravel aisles, and then you'll find some mini storage facilities that have paved aisles. And it's not a function of the use, it's a function of what zoning district the property is in. And so I can think of 2 that came before the Planning Commission. There's both of them, I think, were done by George Stein, and both of those ended up having paved aisles because of the zoning that the property was in, but we do have many storage facilities that have gravel aisles. And so right now, the triggers that we have are a change that use that results in an increase of number of required spaces, but again, only the new or expanded parking area must be paved, or you do a building addition and that results in an increase in the number of required spaces, the new or expanded area must be paved. But if you have a building permit or a new occupancy that does not result in an increased parking requirement, that does not trigger a paving requirement. So we have a recent example of a project that Dustin and I were involved with, and there was a former liquor store, retail liquor store at the southwest corner of Pacific and Santa Fe. And that former liquor store has a gravel parking lot. And there is a proposal to change that, which had been vacant for a short period of time, to a shaved ice business. That falls under this category right here, a building permit or new occupancy that does not result in an increased parking requirement does not trigger a paving requirement. So we had a building that had a liquor store in it. It closed. It was proposed to reopen as a shaved ice business, and our ordinance does not require that as part of that change of occupancy or use that the parking be paved. So we don't have any event or activity that requires a grandfathered gravel parking lot to be paved in its entirety. So the challenge that creates is one of the things about grandfathering is that you still assume with grandfathering that gradually you're going to eliminate the gravel parking areas over time. But we have not, because we don't have very many triggers that require the gravel parking to be upgraded to a paved standard. So in other words, the property that's at the corner of Santa Fe and Pacific is Zone C5 Service Commercial. C5 district requires that all parking and driving aisles be paved unless you're grandfathered in. And so presently, there are two issues with that. One, there may not be enough triggers for paving. The other thing is that the way the ordinance is presently worded, only the new or expanded parking area must be paved. So the result is very little is going to happen that's going to upgrade existing gravel areas to paved, absent a complete removal and new construction on a site. So the aspects of that are two different issues. One is the grandfathering issue. The other is the exemption issue altogether. And one of the things that was of interest to us is, are there other cities that just because you're zoned I-2 or I-3, you don't have to, and you build a new building, you don't have to pave your parking? And what we found was that we are distinctly in the minority on that question. The only community that we looked at or in our survey that was similar to that was McPherson. All of the other communities that we surveyed require paid parking for new construction in I-2 or I-3 zoned areas. So we have those summarized for you. There's a few things in there that made sense to us that were good to either add or clarify or retain. In Ottawa, they have language that makes it clear that if you have a driveway that connects a gravel alley to a rear garage or parking area, that driveway can be gravel. That makes a lot of sense, that if the city isn't going to pave the alley, you're kind of hard-pressed to ask the resident to pave their driveway to connect to a gravel alley. Both Manhattan and Lawrence have exemptions in there for KU and K-State football games, because you could imagine if you had a strict enforcement of a paid parking ordinance, and on football game days, you have quite a bit of parking that occurs on unpaved surfaces. So they have called that out, and that is a possibility as well to something we don't address, but overflow parking or special events that address the ability to park on unsurfaced areas in an overflow or special event situation. But the main thing we wanted to point out is that we looked at, in no particular order, but from west to east, Olathe, Pittsburgh, DeSoto, Ottawa, in the Kansas City area, Lawrence, Topeka, Manhattan, Junction City, Hayes, McPherson, Newton, Hutchison, Wichita, and the only one of that group that exempted I-2 and I-3 zoned areas from paving is McPherson, and all those other areas paving was required. As we pointed out before, the reason that hasn't been a big issue in the airport area on property controlled by the airport authority is they require paving through private covenants, which are above and beyond what we require. So that's kind of a summary of our report. We also provided a summary of some language from the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, that just has some criteria there for when there might be a justification for a waiver of the paving requirement, which some of those items make sense. And then they have some language in there about changes to have that paving requirement kick in. So I guess what we'd like some feedback from the commission is we're since 1988 exempting I-2 and I-3 zoned areas that have new development from paved parking. Is there any interest on the part of the commission to close that loophole for I-2 and I-3 zoned areas and just have a paving requirement across the board for all new development? And then are there any triggers that you would like to look to for retrofitting or going back? And I don't want to pick on them, but I'll just give you the example of for years Knowles Country Real Estate was located in a little red barn there at Ashen, Ohio. Then they went out of business, and Terry Berger bought that and moved in there, didn't make any changes to the building, and inherited that gravel parking lot, which if it was done under other circumstances today would have to be paved. So is there any event or trigger or something you have in your mind as to when that business should have to go back and pave that parking lot?
What if you required paving per zoning requirement, and that still doesn't address I-1, I-2, and I-3, but we can talk about that in change of use, change of occupancy, any of those situations, or new construction, building permit pulled on. What if you required paving? In other words, if you're in a C zone and you do any of those three, you have to pave it.
And you're talking about the entire area?
Well, I don't know about the entire area. If you got a 20-acre lot and you're only going to at least pave the entrances and the required parking.
Right, but let's go back to my example, which is a pretty small area there at the southwest corner of Santa Fe and Pacific. Are you saying that if the liquor store closes and we have a change of use and a new business, which is shaved ice business, that they should have, as a result of that, go in and pave the existing gravel area?
That's my question, yes. That would be my thought.
One of the things,
and that's an example of a trigger.
one of the things that came to my mind in the previous discussion And I don't think this is a feasible way to do it, but I think one has to look at the income-generating capacity of that business. Doubt that a shaved ice business is going to have the capacity to pave a parking lot. An insurance agency might be something different. But I don't think that can be a criteria for whether you pave it or not.
Seems like we're changing the value of that person's property when we're requiring them to do that. That's difficult for me to make a decision based on what I'm hearing.
Right.
The other problem I've seen in the past is that you may see a property owner let their building go delinquent and not do any upgrades to it because they know that will trigger a paving. And then the outside goes to pot. They don't do anything with it because it may require some sort of a building permit or even an electrical. I mean, if they have to do some work in there and it requires electrical permit, they don't do that because they know it's going to generate a $20,000 paving. So now you have a safety hazard as well as it starts to look a bad business.
And I don't want to single out Mr. Welsh and his business, but that was part of the rationale for we have a neighborhood revitalization tax rebate program, and one of the things that was a lot of property owners indicated is that we make improvements or we invest in our property and then we're almost punished for it by increase in appraised value and property taxes. And so the rebate program that we have that is primarily in the core area of Salina allows a business owner to invest, make improvements, and then they get a rebate of the amount attributable to the increased investment so that they don't have tax penalty or consequences for having improved their property. But that, what Mr. Welsh pointed out, is exactly what we heard back in 1990, that if I make this improvement to my property or I seek out a new tenant, now the consequence is you're going to force me to pave my parking. I'll just leave it vacant and let the gravel parking remain. So the argument that was made in 1990 is that that's a disincentive to do that. The flip side of that is that if you don't have something, then you don't ever move in the direction that people would like to move to, which is to upgrade the standard and the appearance.
I want to be sure we understand why we're doing this. I think there's maybe 3 reasons, 2 of which the property owner may have an interest in, maybe all 3. If we're doing it because we like the looks of paved parking lots, that's 1. If we're doing it because paved parking lots are safer, people don't fall in them, there aren't potholes, you don't have to realign your car every time you go in there. Or the third one is that they're accessible for handicapped people.
Yeah.
Now, I can think at least of 2 of those that the property owner has a great stock in. One, that it be safe, because I guarantee you, if I fall in somebody's gravel parking lot and break my hip, I'm not going to come to the Planning Commission to get relief. I'm going to go litigate. And I think the same thing can be true with accessibility. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where we want to go. I could see us saying we're not going to let any new gravel parking lots come in, but let the old ones remain, perhaps, because I think there's incentives for individual business owners to do something with those properties. Maybe that takes too long, I don't know.
There's one piece that I think it's a bit of a concern, and how much I don't know, but gravel parking lots within a city have an environmental issue problem too. Not all of us like to eat dust all the time, and don't have to wash our deck off every time we use it. You let too many gravel lots go, and they're used extensively, you have this dust problem. Many communities have really taken a strong stand against dust emissions, and that is a problem. And so I don't know at what point that becomes a huge issue. Maybe not in Salina, but it can.
Dean, any other big companies that you can think of that have gravel parking that have asked, has any of them met the criteria, whether it be in I-2 or wherever, where they did half hard surface, and then the rest they did in gravel recently in the last 10 years?
Well, example that Dustin and I have worked with frequently would be Great Plains Manufacturing over on East North Street. They, almost all their holdings are either I-2 or I-3. So based on that, they would be allowed to have gravel parking, but they choose and have chosen to pave all of their employee parking over there because that is their preference for maintenance, appearance purposes, keeping dust down, as was mentioned. But I don't know, I think we keep a campus parking running total over there. They have somewhere close to 500 off-street parking spaces, all of which are paved. If all of that was gravel, that would have quite an impact in terms of dust and things of that nature. So that is an example there. Most of what we run into, I think it would be primarily North Salina. We had some discussion when there was reuse of the former Moose Lodge, which has a area that's got both paved and gravel parking. So we have a lot of it has to do with our corridors, like North Santa Fe, to a degree, Broadway, where we have that. It is, in some cases, viewed as an aesthetic issue, or that you have development all around that has attractive parking and landscaping, and you have one property that is not in keeping with that. So I guess to focus on that, issue number one is, should the present loophole that says that I have I-2 or I-3 zoning and no matter what my use is, I can have gravel parking, should that loophole be closed so that all new development across the board except for the items, if you could go back up to the top, in other words, should all or some of these exemptions be maintained, or should what you're seeing in a lot of these communities, even though they have pre-existing gravel, is they're basically saying none of these exemptions exist. If you built a new house in Salina today, your driveway approach would have to be paved with concrete, but if you chose to have a gravel driveway, you could. Or you'll see people who have a paved driveway and then they put down crushed rock as an apron or wing on their driveway, and that is permissible today. But right now, it is optional whether you pave your residential driveway. If that loophole was closed, then all residential driveways, new construction or placement of homes, would have to have paved driveways. And then this applies to duplexes or other small areas. But question number one is, we've had these loopholes in place that allow new construction, new development with gravel parking. Should that loophole be re-examined? And then the other question is, should there be more triggers for paving, and then do you go back and require that the entire lot be paved, or the provision we have now is I have a building, it has gravel parking, I build an addition, the addition requires more parking, only the part that supports the addition would have to be paved. Those are two separate issues, and I guess we'd like to get feedback on the loophole first, and then the other part is certainly more challenging. But the second question, is there ever an event that would trigger going back and paving an entire existing gravel lot?
My recommendation, my thinking would be that a building permit on a commercial property or an electrical, something that they pulled for an electrical or a safety issue would not trigger, but any square footage ever added to that building would set a precedence that they would have to do for all of it, their old square footage as well as their new square footage, not just what's allowed for the new square footage. But that would get away from somebody pulling a building permit to keep their property up to compliance and not trigger, not want to do the preventive maintenance and trigger the paving. But if they did any type of additional square footage, that would trigger for the existing building and the new portion of whatever that would be for paving. Now, from the residential side, I think we got to close that loophole quickly. I can't imagine somebody living in an area, and I mean, some of them have restricted covenants by the builder and the developer that they can't have gravel drives. Of the new additions, I think that we have coming in has to be hard surfaced, but somebody could leave out of their covenants, or somebody could put in development that they don't, and there's nothing we can do.
I'm not sure that everybody understands that I could, and I'm not even familiar. Mr. Byquist does have covenants. I don't know if they address that, but I mean, I could conceivably go out, buy a lot in Quail Meadows Estates, build my own house, and decide that I want to leave my driveway gravel. And it doesn't matter that all the lots around me are paved. The city is not going to require that.
But the
developer
right-of-way has
could.
to be paved.
What's that?
The right-of-way portion.
The
back-
approach
back
has
of
to
the
be
side, the
paved,
approach
but
has to
behind that could be gravel.
And then, if you were going to try and control, like where people put boats on the side and there's gravel there, how would you ever know, how would you know what's grandfathered in and what isn't? I could bring in a load of gravel on Saturday and have it, and how would you know?
Grandfathering is fun.
Yeah, I mean, you would
That's-
know
it's
whether
a
that was in there
challenge.
before or not.
And that's why, and it's not just laziness, but, you know, we, as a city staff here in Salina, tried to address the grandfathering issue straight on, and when I looked at all these different communities and their paved parking standards, none of them really addressed the pre-existing issue. Only a few of the communities did. City of Wichita, City of Ottawa, some of those, but part of that is it's just really hard to determine that. Right now, we have you cannot park on the grass in your front yard. You can't park an RV or a boat or anything in your front yard area unless it's on a hard surfaced driveway. But hard surfaced also includes gravel.
Well, I think, I sort of tend to agree with Todd about if you're going to expand your business in any way with square footage additions, that would trigger a paving requirement, I think. I mean, it just seems logical. I agree that if you're getting a permit to put in new wiring, I'm not sure that changes the paving requirement, but certainly to expand your business seems like it would trigger the paving requirement. And I'm a little surprised about the driveway myself. I mean, I think that's a loophole we just close, I mean, somehow, whatever that takes.
Well, the threshold we use for landscaping is any building addition that increases the building size by 30% or more, or any renovation that increases the valuation of the property by 50% or more triggers a landscaping requirement.
So that could trigger paving as well, then, maybe.
If you took that approach, you could have
Be
a
consistent.
similar approach that would be consistent. But my examples of how it changes incrementally over time is if you take the corner of Crawford and Ohio, and you used to have filling stations on the southeast corner and the southwest corner that were basically paved, every square inch was paved, and then when McDonald's went in and replaced the filling station, they came in and provided front yard landscaping along Crawford and Ohio, and where Subway came in and replaced the old DX station there, they provided landscape buffer along Crawford and along Ohio Street. So now you have 2 out of the 4 intersections that have landscaping, the other 2 where Long John Silver's is and the convenience store have none. But if those corners were to redevelop, then you would gradually improve the green space and landscaping situation. So the question, if you never have a trigger that requires a gravel lot to be paved in its entirety, then you're not going to move in that direction. So I guess
One of my questions when Mr. Walsh was talking about any expansion you addressed with the present 30% and 50% criteria, and I wondered about that too. And I guess my other question would be, do you think that is an appropriate, it would be consistent, is it an appropriate trigger for the paving issue?
it's probably an appropriate issue to go back and justify paving the entire lot. Because that's a substantial change.
The only other one I might add is to Mr. Box's from safety is is it out of line that on any permit, whether it be electrical or electrical upgrades or plumbing upgrades, even though you're not adding square footage, any permit that is drawn from somebody who is grandfathered in would be required to at least put in a pad the size of a handicap van facility or anything like that? Would that,
Well,
we can all around that, but at least the answer
I'll
is
tell you
that.
how that was addressed at the southwest corner of Pacific and Santa Fe. The building code requires that if you obtain a building permit and make renovations to a building, you have to devote at least 20% of your construction budget towards making ADA accommodations. What was done there was deemed that having a handicapped accessible restroom was more important than having a handicapped parking space. So when they did that project, 20% of the investment had to go towards improving accessibility, and that investment went towards an accessible restroom as opposed to accessible parking. But if you had that, then you could potentially have if you had a paving trigger that said if you add more than 30% in area or 50% in value to a building, that triggers a paving requirement. You could have something that says anything below that triggers a requirement that you add an paved accessible parking space if you don't have one. So it could be written in that way, and presently the floodplain regulations exempt projects that are done to remedy a code violation.
So, for example, the snow shack, what you just said would have not triggered paving, but would have triggered
At least one
handicap
accessible
accessible.
stall.
I like that only because
But they would have had to have added on to the building at least 30% to have required the full lot to be paved.
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but how about, you apparently have some good ideas of how this might look. What if we ask you to put together a recommendation for us as staff and bring it back for our consideration, rather than us trying to design the recommendation here? I
Right.
think you know that we have some interest in requiring paving in certain areas. We've made that clear. Maybe you could put together a recommendation, something we could approve, and we could act on it.
Right. What we just needed today was, is there interest in eliminating loopholes and looking at additional
absolutely,
triggers? I'm
absolutely.
hearing that there is, so we would initiate something on your behalf.
I think the only one that I haven't heard clarity on to give them recommendation of where to go would be the entire, if somebody came in today in I-2, would they be required to pave everything? I didn't hear any clarification on that.
We just approved, wasn't it I-2 the other night with the truck depot at the corner of Waterwell Road, and we asked them to pave that. And
Right, but the only way that could be done
Well, we haven't
is,
done that.
is
That's right.
basically through covenants where the seller, developer is the one requiring that, not you.
But I'm personally, I'm interested in having that part of I-2 requirements as well. Sure. And I'm not sure it shouldn't be part of I-3.
Right. The question is, Party A builds a mini storage facility in I-1, and he has to pave everything. Party B builds the same facility in I-2, and he doesn't have to
And he
pave
should have to
anything.
pave
Should that
everything.
loophole be closed?
Yes, I think so.
There you go.
That give you,
Okay?
Abner?
Yeah, so
We have-
basically,
we-
basically, I think there's 3 new construction deals that are loopholes now that ought to be removed. The first one is residential, new construction. So we name a date sometime when this becomes effective, and from that point on, you can no longer have a gravel driveway on a new residence.
Right.
And then the I-2 and the I-3 ought to have paving requirements from the beginning on any new ones.
Yeah,
So-
and that was part of our research, and we
From
simply
now on.
didn't find any communities that treated I-2 or I-3 any differently.
Yeah.
and then I think the addition on buildings, if it's so much of an, maybe mirroring the landscape requirement, and that triggers paving requirement at the same time.
So the triggers that we've talked about, or we've heard you guys talk about, deal with improvements, whether that be an improvement in size to your existing structure or the improvement in value. I also heard some talk of occupancy changes. Is that something that you're still interested in, or do we want to focus in on the building improvement
It
side?
depends on the number of employees involved in occupancy change. I mean, I don't know if the iShack, it's a liquor store and an iShack exchange, how many more employees are involved in that? I mean, how many more people are going to be, is it more required, how much more parking is going to be required for the employees? How much, there's got to be some kind of a trigger there that says, just because you change occupancy, did it change the whole business, change the traffic, I guess,
Yeah, both customer and.
But I
for
still,
the
do
customer and the
you have any
employees.
thought process on the handicap thing, though? If somebody whose grandfathers, take this snow shack down there, they've been grandfathered in, they're not doing any extension on their property, adding any square footage, but they had to get a building permit to do interior alterations, should that trigger a handicap pad?
There's something in our codes now, a certain amount of construction triggers
Yeah,
some
but-
handicap commitment, doesn't it, Dustin?
Well, it's what Dean mentioned before, that it's based on the valuation of your improvement. So if you have a $100,000 improvement, 20% of that has to be allocated towards ADA compliance if you're not already compliant. If you're already compliant, it doesn't matter. If you've got parking stalls, you've got path of travel, you've got restrooms, it doesn't matter. But if there are items in which you are out of compliance with ADA, 20% of those improvements have to go towards becoming ADA compliant. Now, at that point, there is actually a prioritized table of which you kind of go down. And what Dean was mentioning with our snow shack at Pacific and Santa Fe is the first item on that list is restrooms. It's not parking stalls. But if you spend enough money, you'll get down to parking stalls and you'll get down to those other ADA items. So to answer your question, yes, ADA parking stall requirements are part of that list, but it depends on the valuation and how far down the list you go and how much you spend.
But if they, so for the snow shack again, if the only thing they did was go in there and apply for a permit to update the electrical, and they had one bathroom, and that was their plan to have that, but they wanted to update that, and they got a permit for that, that doesn't, I mean, 20%, I mean, if he's going to do $1,500 worth of work, doesn't, 20% of $1,500, you're not going to do anything for ADA.
Right.
But it
Right.
would trip, so I'm just trying to figure out that how the people are getting away pretty good who are grandfathered in. If we're not going to, at some point, come up with that 5-year figure that said, okay, in 5 years you have to be done, as Dean said, that didn't work out very well, something has to trigger for at least us to get a handicap pad. I don't know about you, but I can't imagine them trying to go to all of these places we've grandfathered in and to try and get out of a van on a wheelchair and try and roll across a gravel parking lot. I think something has to trigger, at least, at minimum, the handicap pad. And the only way I can see to do that is if they pull any building permit, whether it's for a piece of wire or to connect anything on there, that's going to be a trigger for that. And then they have to make the decision of, do I want to rewire my building, and because it's going to trigger a $800 parking pad. But I think for us to have, in this day and age, for us not to have accessibility for handicapped people to go and to a new business, the same way I'd be able to park and be able to walk in there, I just think that we've got to put that trigger in place.
Todd, for a new business, is that right?
For a new business, I even think an existing business, if that was a snow shack and they were in there now, and they've been a snow shack for 2 years, and then they needed to, for whatever reason, they needed to rewire their building for code purposes, that would then say, not only do you need to rewire, but you need to pour an $800 pad out front, because that triggers the new thing for handicap accessibility.
You know, it heartens me, and I'm in total agreement with you about the need for ADA compliance. I mean, I think we need to emphasize that. So I'm 100% with you on that. The one thing that crosses my mind when you talk about getting a new wire in place and having to put in that pad is that you're going to get the black helicopter folks coming in and saying, look, you're trying to run our lives, government intrusion, et cetera. And I don't know whether Dustin's means testing essentially in terms of development is sufficient. Maybe we could look at adjusting the level at which that pad requirement would be the requirement for that. But
Well, it's an easier requirement than the commission saying, okay, you got to pave everything now,
yes.
even whether you're grandfathered in or not.
Yeah, this is why I'm kind of in agreement with Mr. Kennedy about getting some, and I appreciate you've given some pretty specific guidelines so far, Dustin and Dean. If there are any other suggestions you would have for those kinds of triggers, whether it be tighter requirements on the amount of money spent or whatever, I'd welcome hearing about that.
Well, not only do I think I'm not interested in having paved parking lots and handicapped and all those kinds of things, I just want to be sure that we don't have to do more than we absolutely have to do to get that accomplished. I know of, I'm sitting here and I won't say their names because I don't think that's appropriate, but I know of at least 3 businesses in this town that have paved their parking lots. And 2 of them I know for sure didn't have to. They just did. And I don't know how many individuals or businesses in this community have made their facilities accessible to handicapped people without being forced to. Now, I don't know where that tipping point is. I think by closing the loopholes and doing some things, we will create a tipping point where all of a sudden it's not businesslike, it's not acceptable to have less than paved and less than accessible. And so maybe we don't worry about trying to get the whole apple, we just take a good big bite, and there'll be people who will come along. So I guess I'm in favor of as least that we have to do to get where we want to go, and that's have everything paved and everything accessible. So.
Anything else?
I think that gives us good guidance.
Okay. Anything else you want to add, Dean?
Nope.
Okay.
We will meet on March 5th, and I know or believe that March 19th may fall within
Spring
the
break.
spring break
Probably not.
period, and we're going to need everybody to carefully check their calendars and give some advance notice to Crystal or other staff members on that, because we presently have 8 items filed for the March 19th meeting, and it would be very important that we be able to achieve a quorum to do that, or if we
Probably
can't, it would be very important to know in advance so that we can adjust accordingly. But as it presently falls in terms of our schedule, we have 8 agenda items filed, which partially reflects just an increase in activity level over what we've seen in the past. So if you're absolutely certain that you're not going to be here on the 19th of March, we need to do a head count, because we have to have at least 5 planning commissioners present in order to conduct business.
Do you think you think Crystal could send out something, when's the last date you need to know who's going to be here? Maybe she could send a little email and say, do you plan to attend? That way we'll have a chance to look at our calendars and see.
Well, Thursday is our deadline where we would advertise public hearing items in the Salina Journal. And you could still potentially change after the fact if it was just clear that there was not a quorum. But we also send out property owner letters to residents and owners within 200 feet of the various request areas, and I don't, if there was any probability that we weren't going to be able to have 5 members present on the 19th, I don't think we'd want to send out hundreds of property owner letters to folks inviting them to a March 19th public hearing if that March 19th hearing's not going to occur.
Well, we have members absent, so she's just about going to need to, and you shook your head that you could do that.
Yeah, so we could do an email reminder and ask you to respond and do a head count, but I know Crystal has a whole pile of envelopes and things on her table for all the various applications that are currently have a March 19th. We'll call it a tentative hearing date, but if we simply, we have tried to avoid that if we could in the past, because it's almost like a holiday in Salina, but we just had so many people targeting that particular time frame with their applications, and by the time we were done, it added up to 8 different cases. So we can adjust, but we really need to know as soon as possible if we can achieve a quorum.
Perfect. All right, we're adjourned.